let's take a look here. Okay, so this is pretty interesting. Pretty even numbers say they think the kind of labor productivity story of Bloom Sachs is most important, and the Acemoglu Johnson Robinson story, about a quarter each. About half of you say both, and a couple people say neither. Great, so we're going to discuss these now. So does anybody who said neither want to raise their hand and say why they think both of these seem, maybe not like very strong explanations for this correlation? Like you have maybe an alternative story in mind? Yeah. I see. So you're raising a point that actually maybe we've got the data to answer this question. We've been seeing infant mortality falling, all these health improvements, but in many parts of the world, not that much economic growth. So it just doesn't seem like that story is the right story to begin with. You think the causality may go in the other direction, or at least to a certain extent. Great. Okay. Any other thoughts? Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that there's been a lot of this discussion about what Acemoglu Johnson Robinson's take is on China, but strictly speaking, in their research in these papers, China's excluded because it wasn't settled by Europeans. The whole point was like there's certain areas settled by Europeans with either a sort of more representative strategy for institutions or more exploitative strategy. And since yes, China was influenced a lot by the foreign powers in the 18th and 19th century, but they weren't colonized in the same way. So I think strictly speaking, it's sort of outside the scope of their data at least. But that's but I know that in some of his popular writing, Daron is very kind of pessimistic about future growth in China. That's true. Okay. Great. So this is the argument. Let me get into it in a little bit more detail. So this is the Acemoglu Johnson Robinson argument, and this is where we get to the multiple links in the chain, kind of like the point that was raised before. So their claim is where there was less European settlement, the colonizers didn't put in place very representative institutions. In fact, they put in place that had very little rule of law, very little property rights protection, and they basically extracted resources at the barrel of a gun. And so this is like a caricature of like maybe what the Belgian Congo. Actually, maybe the Belgian Congo case is not even a caricature. This is like what the Belgian Congo was like. So the Belgian colonizers wanted to extract lots of rubber from the Congo, and they basically forced Africans to work a certain number of days a year, say a couple months a year, basically as slaves on the Belgians' rubber plantation in Congo. There was no attempt to protect their property rights. There was no attempt to provide any sort of legal protection. That was it. So the only institutions that were set up were institutions of coercion and control to extract rubber. That was it. That was the goal of the colony. And when you go to Brussels and you see those beautiful boulevards, they were all built with that rubber money, literally. So it made Belgium, this tiny country, incredibly rich, but impoverished the Belgian Congo. Okay, so that's one possibility. And if this is the key step, if those institutions are somehow persistent, if once you set up coercive laws and coercive institutions and coercive, unrepresentative political systems, if those things tend to persist, then you might see effects of those institutions beyond the period of colonization. Look, if upon independence, newly independent African countries could just wipe the slate clean and say, look, the Europeans did terrible things to us, we're going to just erase their influence, set up our own institutions, then there wouldn't necessarily be any historical persistence. But it turns out, if you look at the data, sadly and unfortunately, a lot of the places where the Europeans set up the most extractive, brutal institutions have worse measures for governance, rule of law, property rights protections today. It turned out to be persistent. It wasn't as easy as like flipping the switch upon independence. It's not easy to build new institutions. So the persistence is really key. And they claim, if you look at the mortality of Europeans during the colonial period when they attempted to settle and trade in Africa, the differential mortality across different regions can explain a lot of current income differences across countries. Like a huge effect. Okay, let me pause. What are people's take on this theory of the world, this view of the world? Where are the kind of weaknesses in the argument, in the logical argument? So I don't understand. Saying the argument is things haven't changed that much because there still is a lot of exploitative foreign investment or domestic policy. Oh, so you're saying there really is persistence. You're saying the exploitative practices have continued in new forms or something like that. Okay, I mean, they would say, yes, there is institutional persistence. Now, explaining exactly why they don't do in their article. Yeah. So there's tremendous variability. There is some data on this, and there's tremendous variability in different parts of Africa in terms of economic institutions, political institutions. There were some areas that had more representative institutions or less representative institutions. So it's hard to characterize in one way, but I think the general consensus among people who have studied the kind of imperialist project of the Europeans is no matter how bad things were before, there was more representation before European colonization than there was once the Europeans colonized. So there were traditions of, for instance, in many parts of East, Central, and Southern Africa, traditions of village assemblies that may not have been as regularized as a parliament, but there were regular village assemblies where there was a norm of discussion, debate, and all that was shut down really under European rule. So I think we should think of the transition to European colonization as a period where a lot of local representation was shut down. I think that's one way to characterize it. I actually changed the syllabus this year. I used to have an article, maybe I'll talk about it a little bit last week, but there are a couple of cases of countries in Africa that the Europeans colonized but kind of left alone. So the most famous case is Botswana. So Botswana is a country that is basically desert. Before they found diamonds there, no one was really too interested in Botswana. So when it was an English protectorate, they didn't even, for long stretches of time, have any English officials in Botswana. They just ruled it from South Africa. Like they were totally disinterested in it. So that was a place where actually the traditional institutions were left more or less intact. So to the sort of modern day, so when Botswana becomes independent, they have a very different political tradition than some of their neighbors who for 2 or 3 generations had basically had their traditional institutions torn apart. So I think there are a couple of windows into traditional institutions we can turn. So maybe at the end of the course, if we come back to Botswana, we can talk more about that. There's another hand up.
Yeah, like, it makes you wonder what kind of institutions you're talking about when you talk about abstract institutions. Like most of the post-Soviet countries, themselves, institutions are still in place. They still have really high growth, here. So
yeah.
Even though they're abstract, they might still work.
Yeah, it's around this time of Bloom Sachs 98, Acemoglu Johnson 2001. There's another famous paper, Easterly and Levine 1997. There was a whole series of papers trying to explain Africa's low growth. It had already been a couple decades by that point. Some of the explanations just don't kind of resonate as much with us now that Africa's been growing for 15 years. It's kind of like, well, maybe they've overcome some of that, right? And that's a little bit of your point. Well, however bad these institutions are, like Africa's growing again. They're growing pretty quickly. So I think that's an interesting point. Maybe this is less relevant than it was before. Okay, Riley. I think for them it's a little tricky to look at India as a whole. There are economic history papers, very interesting economic history papers, that do something similar for different sub-regions of India. So for instance, during the British period, there were very different land tenure arrangements set up in different parts of India. And there's a paper by Abhijit Banerjee and co-author in the American Economic Review that makes the case that the areas that had more extractive local labor policies are doing worse today. So it's a lot like Acemoglu Johnson Robinson, but for sub-areas, sub-regions of India. Okay. So the key channel here between disease and growth is this issue of European settlement leading to certain institutions. This is Acemoglu Johnson Robinson's story. For Bloom and Sachs, this is the channel, low labor productivity. So I've just written it out a little differently than before. So this is the debate. What is the mechanism? Even if we know that tropical disease is leading to lower income, there could be radically different explanations. And sorting these things out is critical. And every time there is a study from another setting, like the India setting, there's a study by a woman named Melissa Dell, who has a paper on exploitative labor practices in Peru. And again, in one region of Peru, they had these practices, in another they didn't. She finds that areas that had more exploitative and extractive labor institutions 150 years ago, they're poorer today. So there's a number of studies that show that there's some long-term persistence of this. Yeah. It's a great question. What is persisting? And this has been a lot of the debate that I think Acemoglu Johnson Robinson have had with historians. And a lot of historians are very critical of most of their stuff, or a lot of their stuff is historians tend to okay, explain exactly how this is working. There's been so much institutional change, say, in these African countries since the 1880s or 1890s. Independence, democratization, institutional reform, point to the institution, point to the law. And I think Acemoglu Johnson Robinson have a lot of trouble pointing to the law. They're finding correlations in the data, but they don't know exactly why. So, a critic could say, well, you claim you're getting at the mechanism, but how do I know it's really the mechanism if you can't really point to something specific? And that's, so I think that's still part of the debate right now about their work. So, okay. Why do we care about this mechanism? Well, as academics, as researchers, as intellectuals, as scholars, we want to understand the world. So we actually just want to understand how the world works. We want to understand our history. We want to understand where we come from. So from that point of view, we care about the mechanism on a purely intellectual basis. This is a fascinating issue. Beyond that, we care about it for a very applied public policy reason. The public policy implications of the red theories and the blue theories I had up there are totally different. Okay, so if Acemoglu Johnson Robinson are right, where should economic reform in poor countries focus? What should we be trying to change? We should be trying to change the institutions. We should be trying to change the property rights and the rule of law and corruption, all these institutional qualities. If Bloom and Sachs are right, what should we be trying to invest in or change? Health. We should try to improve health. That's what makes people wealthier. So there's actually a huge debate within the World Bank, within donor communities, very much along these lines. Where should we be putting our money? There's a camp of people that want us to put our efforts into institutional reform. And there's another camp of people that say, wow, reforming institutions is really hard. Let's do something else, or maybe health is just a better investment. Yeah. Well, they look at current income data, and they find this correlation between the historical settlement and current incomes. Now, as part of their debate with Sachs, these guys have written multiple papers back and forth sort of against each other's points. Acemoglu Johnson Robinson have been trying to also get more contemporaneous health data to try to say, this correlation between health and income you talk about isn't really nearly as strong as you say it is. So they're also kind of trying to undermine the opposing arguments. And Sachs has written a lot saying, you talk about institutions, but institutions are the product of development, not their cause. If we were only rich enough, we'd be able to afford good institutions. If we were rich enough, we'd be able to afford better judicial systems, rule of law, all of that. So they're kind of arguing with opposite causal arrows. And then our job is to try to figure out the truth. Which of these is actually closer to the truth in the data, with huge implications, as we just said. Depending on who's right, the World Bank, national governments, donors, everybody should be doing different things. So the stakes are very high in this debate. Now, to sort of come full circle a little bit, it turns out that this distinction also ties in a bit to the distinction we raised in our economic growth models between A factors and K factors. Acemoglu Johnson Robinson are making the A argument. It isn't really your health, your human capital, all that stuff is secondary. What really matters are the institutions that govern how you combine all these inputs. Without those, you're not going to go anywhere. And Sachs is saying, Bloom and Sachs are saying, forget institutions. If only we had enough of these factors, healthy workers, productive, healthy, well-educated workers, that's what's going to allow us to grow. So it's the A versus K story sort of again. So again, that's why this debate I think is so fundamental, is it ties into very different worldviews about what the priorities are in development. And of course, it's more complicated than that because maybe you need good A to accumulate K. And we talked about some of those distinctions. What are people? Any thoughts or reactions at this point? Yeah, in the back. It's very widespread. In the 50s, in the 60s and 70s, there was a huge emphasis on infrastructure that was criticized. But since then, there's no kind of clear pattern. There's a lot that goes into health and education. There's a lot that goes into strengthening government capacity, bureaucratic capacity. There's now been sort of a resurgence of investment in infrastructure. I don't have the numbers in front of me, and it's hard to classify just because so much money goes through NGOs and other channels that are a little hard to track. The World Bank in the 1990s made a very explicit policy decision to diversify their lending beyond big infrastructure projects. So they started spending much more widely. Any other thoughts or reactions? Yeah. So you're saying, has this debate changed at all? It is a long time ago. I think the debate still goes on. There's been some really interesting work since then. There's been a lot of research since then. I think the consensus is that health matters. There's a lot of papers showing that health does matter for productivity. We're going to see some of those papers in this course. At the same time, the consensus across the social sciences that institutions matter is very strong right now. And so there's sort of different camps of people working on different things. One thing that's been very good, and we're going to get to this course a lot, one thing that's been very good about the rise of randomized experiments and sort of good micro data in this debate is we're no longer just arguing with kind of broad patterns and broad data where actually the data are consistent with 5 interpretations. We're able to hone in on very specific mechanisms and very specific channels using experiments. And so those are the things you're going to learn about in this course. And this is really the point of my kind of last couple slides is to say these guys focus on historical data, country level data, these broad patterns where it's hard to pin down what's going on. And even beyond that, and I think you guys should be aware of this, there's been a lot of debate about the Acemoglu Johnson Robinson data to begin with. So there was a PhD student here at Berkeley, David Alboui, who's now a professor at Michigan, who basically tried to recreate their data from the historical sources. And when he did so, got totally different results. So that's been contested. I'm not going to take a stand on that one way or the other. But there's just concerns that maybe this historical European settlement theory is not based on the most solid data. And Acemoglu Johnson Robinson and David Alboui went back and forth literally for years, writing working papers, critiquing each other's critiques, until I think they just both collapsed. They all collapsed of exhaustion. But a different way forward, and what we're going to really focus on a lot in this course, is a different approach, a micro approach. An approach that's going to not just talk about broad country patterns, but say, when you improve the health of this individual, what happens to their life, to their education, to their earnings? When you change let's say, the access to finance for this firm, if we want to understand microcredit or microfinance, what happens to this firm? Getting really detailed data at that level. And I think within development economics, there's a consensus that we're going to make a lot more progress in understanding what's going on, the mechanisms, by dealing with real people, real firms, real communities. And you're going to learn a lot of the tools for how to do that in this course. So hopefully go beyond some of these debates. And in fact, problem set 1 is going to actually get into a very closely related analysis. There was a hand up. Did you have a hand up? Did you get your hand up? Go ahead.
About the couple slides ago about A being institutions, it seems like
Yeah.
A is commonly seen as sort of like a glass ceiling factor where no matter how healthy and hardworking
Yeah.
and motivated everyone is, without the institutions in place, that's like
Yeah.
there's an upper limit.
Yeah.
Is that a common viewpoint?
Yeah, and I think if we look at the data, if we accept the view that during the 70s, 80s, 90s, that institutional quality was pretty poor in a lot of African countries. They were undemocratic, very bad rule of law, these kinds of things. There were actually big advances in education and health during that period. I showed you guys some of that data. Infant mortality fell a lot, literacy rates boomed, et cetera, but growth was still negative. So it wasn't enough to invest in human capital. Now, that said, even in the way we've written out the growth model, technology, or institutions and technology, and human capital, or inputs, are complements. In other words, you get more bang for your buck out of better health when institutions are better, and you get more bang for your buck out of institutions when human capital is better. If you multiply two items like that, they're complements. So it doesn't have to be one or the other. In some ways, you do better when you have both than just one or the other. Any last comments or thoughts before wrapping up? Okay, so I'll see you guys on Thursday.